Please give a very warm welcome to Rene. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As some of you might know, my very first encounter with the Lightning Network was 7 years ago here in Berlin on the Lightning Hack Days. That's why I'm wearing this t-shirt, organized by one of the sponsors, Fulmo. So if he didn't organize the events, maybe I would not be standing here today. So I thought I used this very... So I thought I used this very occasion to, after all this time, just summarize everything that I have learned and known about Lightning, routing and liquidity. And I hope this will be interesting for you. So when I thought about the topic, I was like, well, what do I actually know about this? So my first thought was payments fail way too often. And I think this is a problem for a lot of operators and also for a lot of users. And the real question is, why is that the case? And within my research, I think I identified two main reasons of why payments fail. One is the uncertainty about the liquidity that we have in channels. And the other problem is that payments in general may be infeasible due to the fact that liquidity just is not available. So even in the case where we know everything about all of the liquidity, we may just not be able to pay somebody because the min cut of the network is smaller than the amount that we want to pay. I think a lot of people here in the room understand the difference of these two. Historically speaking, that was intermixed originally, and it took us quite some time that we would differentiate these two. So I want to speak about these two topics, but before I start with the infeasibility topic, I want to basically give one high-level overview of the paper that I'm talking about, which is a mathematical theory of payment channel networks. That's basically the work that summarizes all of this and that I've been working on over the last 2 years. And the big picture of how we arrived there is basically in 2021, we published the information theoretic framework to model the uncertainty of liquidity in the network. So it was basically this probabilistic framework to express where the liquidity could be located. I was very proud at that time of that work. I thought this would be very influential, but the Lightning Network community, so to speak, didn't really react a lot to it. They only became really aware of this result when later we used it in the optimally reliable payment flows as the uncertainty cost in the min cost flow computation. And then people looked at it more closely and we received some feedback. And basically people had two main criticisms of this work at that time. So one criticism was that the liquidity in the network is not uniformly distributed as we proposed in the paper. We never said it was uniformly distributed. We just said, for simplicity of calculations, we use a uniform distribution, but you can plug in your own. But people were very dismissive of our research and saying this won't work because we used that as an example. The other one, however, was much more severe, which was the assumption that the liquidity distributions in channels are independent of each other. And this seemed wrong to people. And I mean, it is obviously wrong. If you make a Lightning Network payment, it's being routed through a number of channels. So obviously the state of several channels changes at the same time. So this already shows that everything is connected and not independent of each other. So at some point in time, I felt that I should address these shortcomings. And with the help of integer linear programming and the geometric framework that I'm presenting in the mathematical theory of payment channels, by studying wealth distributions instead of liquidity, we can actually drop the independent assumption by using conservation of liquidity as a constraint. You will understand during the talk what this means. And we can derive the observed bimodal liquidity distributions as a marginal distribution of this global probability distribution of how liquidity is in the Lightning Network, which I think is quite nice because we can now theoretically derive why we observe the liquidity behaves in the way how it does. So this mathematical theory of payment channel networks may help us to do a few things. One is we can study the expected rate of infeasible payments on the network, and we can use this to actually talk about the scaling limitations of the Lightning Network. We have seen some slides where people were saying Lightning was the proposed scaling solution and so on and so forth. Nobody really knew how far Lightning would scale. Well, with this theory and in this talk, we present a framework of how we can express how far we can actually scale Bitcoin payments with the help of the Lightning Network. We can derive better priors to address the uncertainty of liquidity in channels. This may be useful for sending nodes, for wallets, for operators. We can use this to explore potential protocol extensions. If you follow my research closely, you will know that I'm advocating for multi-party channels because the math is quite clear that two-party channels really do not scale payments because they put too heavy constraints to liquidity. And we can use these results also to maybe create services like, for example, help with collaborative liquidity management to improve reliability in case this is useful for operators. This, of course, can be up to debate. So before we go into the theoretical work, let's start with some like empirical simulated situation. So I looked at a snapshot of the Lightning Network at some point in time. This was a snapshot from 2021. And I was wondering, what is the likelihood that a random payment in the network would be feasible? So what I did is I initiated the Lightning channels with some liquidity. I used some random assumption. The result kind of didn't matter what kind of random prior I chose. So I think this one either used a bimodal or a uniform distribution. I don't even remember because it didn't matter for the result. And then on the x-axis, you can see the number of satoshis that I wanted to deliver between a random payment pair. And then I can measure how often for random payment pairs was I able to deliver that amount given the liquidity in the network. And what you can see is a result that everybody already knew. The larger the amount, of course, the higher is the rate of infeasible payments. So the left curve is the full network, and you see very quickly the curve drops. So already if you do like 100,000 sats payments, it's only about 30% of the payment pairs that have sufficient liquidity to fulfill this payment. I'm not talking about the failure of single attempts, but really of the fact that no matter how often you try, you will not be able to deliver that payment. When you restrict yourself to the like professional part of the network, for this I use the nodes that have a BOS core as they are believed to be professionally run. You see that the entire curve shifts to the left side. And then, for example, if you take 100,000 sats as a payment, well then 97.5% of payment pairs were able to handle this payment. I think this goes rather well hand in hand with the result that Christian Decker in 2019 presented at the Lightning conference, where he said, well, when he probed the network, about 5% of payments he couldn't deliver for a similar size, right? So there are just these payments that are infeasible. And I just thought I drew in one other line, and this is the limit for basically 1 million sats payments, and this is like 90% payments are infeasible. Usually I don't talk about exchange rates or something, but just bear in mind this is roughly $1,000, and I think a payment system should be able to handle values of that size, right? You go to a conference, you want to pay your hotel, you want to pay with Lightning. So therefore I drew in this line. So about 10% of those payments seem to be infeasible on that network topology. So before we go into the theory and discuss this a little bit further, we need to understand what we can do about infeasible payments. So what are the strategies to mitigate infeasible payments? Well, obviously we can provide liquidity via on-chain transactions. One way of doing this, as we learned yesterday, is closing and opening channels. When the channel is depleted, just close it, provide new liquidity, replenish the channel. You can do this in a splicing operation to be a little bit more efficient with respect to on-chain footprint, or you can use the loop server and do these kind of like swapping services and do this kind of channel replenishment. The other way that I know to make infeasible payments feasible is if somehow magically payments took place on the network. Recall, swaps were a special case of this, where you basically force a payment in your direction, so you get more liquidity to be able to make a payment feasible. But of course, nodes can send each other payments, and this changes the min cut for many other nodes on the network. It's important, however, to have a little bit of caution in here, because payments taking place can also make payments that were former feasible infeasible. So making payments on the network is not necessarily a good solution, or hoping for payments to occur is not necessarily a good solution to make payments feasible. Also, as we will see in the presentation, payments can reduce the reliability of the network, but we discuss this a little bit later. The key concept that I want you to remember for now is infeasible payments require on-chain transactions. So let's look at the table and try to understand what this means. But before that, we look at the formula. So the supported payments on the Lightning Network per second can be computed rather easily. We take theta, which is the bandwidth that we have on-chain, 7 transactions per second, and we divide it by our expected rate of infeasible payments on the Lightning Network. Because as we just learned, every time a payment is infeasible, we need to do on-chain transaction to provide the liquidity. So what does this mean for our curves that I looked at in the simulation? Well, these are just the exact same numbers from the curve just in a table. So if we take this $1,000 payment here, we had 90% of the payments were feasible, so 0.1 is the rate of infeasible payments. So we take 7 transactions that are supported on-chain, divided by 0.1, we get 70 transactions or 70 payments that the Lightning Network at that time was expected to be able to handle under the assumption that payments should be of the size of up to like 1 million sats. And I mean, yay, Lightning scales Bitcoin payments, right? So this is good. But my feeling is we should much rather end up in this area where we support much higher payment throughput. Well, I mean, according to this table, we just have to lower our expectations. You know, we just make smaller payments. People are telling this story. Lightning is made for Nostr apps and these kinds of things, and everybody's happy with micropayments. But I mean, I'm still here and I want to pay my hotel bill with Lightning, so that's a little bit bad. So the question is, can we do something else? Can we understand better what's going on? And for that, we now have to do a little bit of geometry, a little bit of algebra, a little bit of the fun stuff of math. I decided I take you with me on a journey and walk you through this, so bear in mind with me. Let's take a very small example of 21 coins and 3 users. You do some combinatorial math and you will realize there's 253 possible wealth distributions, how you could distribute these 3 coins among those 3 users. And here you can basically see 3 axes, the wealth of Carol, the wealth of Bob, and the wealth of Alice. And you see this geometrical object that basically depicts all the possible wealth distributions. This is just some geometry. Now, what happens if these 3 users decide they don't want to do an on-chain transaction every time they want to transfer wealth? Right? Making a payment is nothing else than changing the wealth distribution. So let's assume Alice, Bob, and Carol create a small Lightning network among themselves where they have 3 payment channels of capacity 7 each. Well, what you can compute is that there is this red region of feasible wealth distributions that are possible to express within this network. Intuitively, you can think of this very easily. Alice is not able to own 15 coins in this setting because she only has 2 channels of capacity 7, so 14 channels is the most that Alice can own, right? And in a similar way, I think here on the diagram you can see it easiest with Carol. This is the 14 coins limit boundary of Carol's wealth that is possible. We can be a little bit more specific. We can choose a specific point in this polytope. So all these things are called convex polytopes. So we can take this point, and it reflects to the wealth distribution where Alice owns 13 coins, Bob owns 7 coins, and Carol owns 1 coin. So now we can ask ourselves, without looking at how the liquidity is actually being distributed in the channels, because it doesn't matter. Right? I mean, it may matter to find the route quickly, but it doesn't matter for feasibility of payments. We can ask ourselves what kind of payments are possible, and we can do this purely geometrically. So for this, there is a note in the paper, and I'm just quoting this, but important is only this lower formula. So when you want to make a payment, you start with the wealth distribution, and you have a payment amount, and you change the wealth vector by going in the direction of the jth user, and then you go in the opposite direction of the ith user, and this is just user I sending over money to user j. And geometrically, this would look like this, right? So if we have this point here, Alice can go in this direction, she lowers her wealth, and she transfers it to Bob, and she can do this as long as she hits that boundary. And of course, she can also decide to pay Carol, then she goes in this direction until she hits that boundary. And of course, Alice can make much larger payments to Carol because remember, all the channels were of size 7, so Carol has much more inbound liquidity than Bob has. Yeah, and I mean, of course, they can go in another direction, right? You could also have Carol pay Alice or Bob pay Alice, so you go in the other direction. And of course, Carol and Bob also want to pay each other. So we are at this point, and making a payment basically means within this feasible region going somewhere along those lines. And making payments on the Lightning Network then is basically a random walk in this polytope. And I will argue that using this mathematical framework, we can much better describe the actual dynamics that are going on and make statements about what's happening. Yeah. So in order to do it a little bit more formal, we have two observations on the network. When we want to decide, just to go back once more to this diagram, when we want to decide whether a point here, a wealth distribution, is feasible or not given the topology, right? Whether it's blue or whether it's red, we need to solve a math problem. And this is basically a system of linear equations over integers that we need to solve. That's why we're using integer linear programming. So integer linear programming means we have equations, those are called constraints, and I will introduce the constraints that we're having in our setting. So one constraint that we have is called conservation of liquidity. This is something when you studied the Lightning Network already back in 2018, every paper had this. It's like there's the capacity of the channel and the capacity is split between the two peers, right? This is exactly what this formula says. The liquidity on the edge E of user U plus the liquidity on the edge E of user V has to be the capacity of the users, right? So you have a network of M channels, so this means you have M equations that are just the conservation of liquidity. The other thing that you need to know if you have a given wealth distribution, of course, is that the wealth of the users has to be conserved, right? So we also have conservation of wealth. This means that for every user, all the liquidity in their channels has to sum up to the wealth that the user has in this particular state or wealth distribution of the network. So more mathematically speaking, we have two M variables because we have M channels, and the variables are the liquidity of the two peers in each channel that is owned there. We have M constraints coming from conservation of liquidity, and we have N constraints coming from conservation of wealth. And well, there's a final constraint coming from the fixed number of Bitcoin that we have in this situation, but that constraint can be omitted because it's linear dependent to the other constraints. And we can try to solve this integer linear program. What you will note is that M usually is larger than n minus 1. So every mathematician knows if you have a system of linear equations and you have more variables than you have equations, you should have a solution space, right? So this means all of these problems should always have a solution. So that would mean every wealth distribution is feasible, which would mean we could do every payment. But as we just saw already and as we experienced, we can't do that. What is the reason? Well, the solution space is constrained over a bounded region because payment channels cannot have negative values and they're only as big as the capacity. So geometrically speaking, we have this situation where we have this like red three-dimensional cloud of points, which are the liquidity states that are possible in a network of the given topology. And we have two wealth distributions, this one and this one. And the dashed lines here are the solution spaces over all numbers. But when we intersect them with the red area, we see that only one of the wealth distributions is feasible, whereas this one is infeasible. Again, you can see this very quickly. Alice is supposed to have 12 coins here, but she only has a total capacity of 10, so that's obviously impossible. But you can basically geometrically already see and understand this, and you can solve these problems. So this helps us to understand which payments can be feasible without the necessity to model liquidity on the network, and I think this is really nice and neat. The other thing that comes from this is, let's assume we don't do two-party channels, but k-party channels. Our integer linear program now is very similar. Instead of having two M variables, we have km variables. The constraints are the same. I mean, this constraint changes a little bit because now you have the k variables in this equation. But this system of linear equations is much easier to solve. So the solution space becomes much bigger, and the likelihood to intersect this with this bounded area from this diagram is much higher. So if we have k-party channels, we would have much more feasible wealth distributions, which would mean we could increase the rate of feasible payments. So we could eventually arrive at a situation where 99.9% of payments are feasible and where Bitcoin's payments would really scale over the Lightning Network. All right, let's go back to the other reason for payments to fail, which was the uncertainty about liquidity. All right, I have a very small example network. I hope everybody in the back can read this. Basically, all of the channels are 4,000 Satoshis in size. Only the channel between Alice and Carol is 8,000 Satoshis in size. So we assume, again, we start, as in the other example, with a simulation first before we go to the theoretical setting. So for that, we assume that initially the network is in a state where all the channels are 50-50 balanced. And you can see Alice and Carol own 8,000 sets and Bob and David own 4,000 sets. The question then is, of course, if you want to make a simulation and people pay each other, you have to include some routing fees. So I also added routing fees to these edges. And you often hear people talking about the fact that channels deplete because you have source and sink nodes on the network. And I don't want to doubt this. I mean, there are certainly and obviously some people bringing money and some people accepting money on a network. But if you want to have a cash system, eventually you would want to have a circular economy. And people are saying, yeah, right now Lightning doesn't work so well because you don't have the circular economy. I will argue against this. I will argue, well, if you have a circular economy, you still have some effects that are really bad for us. So this is what I did in the simulation. I assumed that everybody pays everyone else with the same likelihood and just 1 Satoshi payments, and I wanted to see what happens. And here you can see the liquidity in the channels, and you basically see they always start here at the top, which is 0.5 in the middle, because that was how I set up the network. And then the liquidity either went down, so the channel depleted on the one end, or the liquidity went up, which means the channel depleted on the other end. Some channels deplete quicker, some channels deplete less quickly, but overall in this particular network with this particular fee structures, all the channels deplete. In a circular economy, right? The wealth didn't change. More surprisingly, if you look more closely, you will see that some of the channels, the liquidity depletes on the cheaper side, right? So for example, this channel, you have an edge that goes in this direction that charges 300 Satoshis, and you have an edge going in that direction that charges 100 Satoshis, and you have 0 Satoshis on that side, but you have 4,000 Satoshis on the other side. However, on that edge, it's quite the opposite. You have an edge that goes in this direction, it charges 200 Satoshis, and it has 0 Satoshis of liquidity, whereas the edge in the other direction is cheaper, it only charges 100 Satoshis, but it still has the entire liquidity. And I already see some people being like, wow, how is this happening? So I see some faces of surprise. But it's not so surprising, because what I did is I did this on a bigger network, and I simulated this. And on the x-axis, you can always see the difference between the incoming and outcoming fee on a channel. And on the y-axis, you see how often the channel depletes on which end. And yes, you find a correlation with fees, but it's only a weak correlation. And I think this has been studied in many research papers, where people realize the fees are not really, on a per channel level, a good predictive feature of depletion. And I will argue the reason is the same of why people thought my probabilistic model was bad, because you can't look at this locally. It's a global problem. It's a global optimization problem of where the liquidity goes. It depends on all the other channels. So the reason in this particular graph why these two channels deplete very weirdly is because this channel has like a really weird fee structure, and it has a lot of capacity, and it puts a lot of constraint on these two channels to behave in a way that the node operator, David, would not be expecting, right? So you have to look globally at these problems. I brought, for the same network, but just rotated, a small simulation where you can see this. So over time, you can see how the channels deplete. But what is even more interesting, as soon as the channels deplete, the routing nodes will actually start to need more attempts because they still initially go along the cheap paths that are already depleted according to their cost function. So they need a second attempt or third attempt in order to find the route. And of course, the other routes are more expensive. So what this means is that on the Lightning Network, over time, I can mathematically prove this is not only an empirical observation. The fees will rise over time, but the reliability drops over time. So I argue that the incentives are not optimally. I mean, it would be great if over time, I mean, we could get more expensive, but maybe with better reliability. I would even prefer to get better reliability and cheaper, but, you know, I mean, yeah. And this also does not only hold on a small, tiny artificial network, but I also simulated this on a larger network. And there again, you could see in the initial warming phase, the attempts are rising until the network stabilizes. And then the fees also are rising until the network stabilizes. So this is all with respect to depletion. But I mean, well, depletion was reported before. There is a 2024 paper by the MBOS people who tried to interpolate and predict the balance distribution. Vitro Mortag from LND criticized my work and went in the LND repository and said, look, your uniform prior doesn't work. We have to use a bimodal prior, and this is much more accurate. I have to say, however, to my defense, already in 2020, we published a paper where we discussed that the liquidity distribution follows a bimodal distribution. So we were aware of this. However, at that time, I also have to be honest, we very hand-wavy discussed this away, as in like the network is very new and the channels were opened on one side, and that's probably the reason why the liquidity is so skew, because we didn't understand the dynamics. But the bimodal distribution is something that we always see. The question, however, is now I showed a simulation and showed how the channels deplete, but can we theoretically use the geometric framework to do this? And luckily, going back to here, we can. So remember, we have a wealth distribution, and here in this particular case, we have these 4 green dots that are all feasible liquidity states for the wealth distribution. And the question is, which of these 4 dots will the network actually choose? Like every dot with the same probability, or maybe this dot or that dot. Like I don't know for this picture, but I know how to compute it, and I will show you. And to be fair, I have to get credit to a group of German Lightning enthusiasts. They run a Telegram channel that is called Blitzdinge, Lightning Things, and they were always discussing to optimize the fee potential. And I was at some point in time asking, like, what is this fee potential? And they're like, yes, so what's happening here is we take the liquidity that a node owns, multiply it with the fee that the node will charge, and this should be maximized, and because then we can have routing fees. And I was like, for an integer linear program, I can always minimize or maximize a cost function on it, on the feasibility region. I was like, what would happen if I optimize the fee potential? Because intuitively speaking, what this means is it mimics the selfish behavior of the routing nodes, because they always snipe the cheap liquidity, the cheap fees, right, globally. So the residual should be the fee potential. So, well, I can solve the integer linear program optimizing this. I can run my simulation, and then you can see I find like almost a straight line. It correlates perfectly to each other. So it seems that we can very clearly, without running a simulation of whom pays whom on the Lightning Network, by just looking at the gossip data and by studying the integer linear program, predict where the liquidity in the Lightning Network is located. Of course, under the assumption that a certain wealth distribution is there. We don't know the wealth distribution, but we can sample this, of course. And with this, we can predict that a channel, for example, is 70% of the time depleted on one end, 20% of the time depleted on the other end, and 10% of the time it's uniformly distributed in between, which I think is a much more accurate prior than the symmetric bimodal distributions that most implementations currently use. What I was even more surprised when doing this is that the number of depleted channels correlated perfectly. This is not an analytic line. This is simulated data. I've never seen this in my entire life, that simulated data is so perfectly on a straight line. The number of depleted channels correlates perfectly with the circuit rank of the network. So what this means is that every channel besides a spanning tree will deplete. And you can also mathematically prove this, given the asymmetric fees on the network. So if we had symmetric fees on a channel, this phenomenon would not happen, but it would be very hard to upgrade the protocol in this way. So I didn't even start the discussion. But given that we observed this, I want to talk a little bit about redundancy and the hub and spoke model and spanning trees. So redundancy of payment channel networks make the network resilient against failure of nodes or channels, right? So it's good to have redundancy. It's something that a lot of people usually want. But every channel besides a spanning tree is expected to be depleted, which is kind of bad. And in a spanning tree and a hub and spoke topology, depletion will just not exist because every feasible wealth distribution has just exactly one feasible liquidity state. And the wealth distributions should be, the feasible wealth distributions should be distributed more or less uniformly globally. I skipped these two things, but I want to share one final result with you that's kind of newish that I shared on Delving Bitcoin. You can use this theory and recognize, well, the emergent behavior on this feasible region is that it goes to the point where the fee potential is maximized. But for reliability reasons, it would be much better to maximize this function, where x0 is the liquidity wishes that every node has. Right? A node has a certain operation and sees, well, I want actually my liquidity to be in those channels and not in the channels where it currently is. Right? And every node on the network could advertise these liquidity wishes, and we could solve the problem again. And I simulated this, and you can see the network makes payments, and all the channels are start to deplete. Then I run this optimization problem, I compute this circulation, and then everything goes back to a balanced state. And then over time, the network depletes again, and then you can reset it. So you would have a rebalancing channel replenishment protocol collaboratively, which is like the best state that we can get that fulfills the interest of all of the nodes. And you could see, like, generally in the network, you have a lot of depleted channels here in the blue curve, a few channels that are uniformly distributed and the other depleted side. But if you use this protocol, most of the liquidity actually is in a rather balanced setting. This was, of course, with the goal that nodes would want to have their nodes balanced. I mean, you could have other goals where nodes want to have certain channels unbalanced in another direction. So, yeah, node operators can choose to collaborate together to run these kinds of protocols and to save on channel replenishment costs. Yeah, if they want to. So what are the design levers and what is the operator's playbook here? Well, I mean, one thing you should do is you should reduce your uncertainty. I think most implementations already do this. You can share liquidity signals that is being discussed in the Bolts repository. You can incorporate the uncertainty cost in cost flow and Dijkstra computation. You can upgrade your priors by using the marginals from the global distribution with the methods that I just showed you in the talk. You can reduce the depletion pressure by advertising symmetric fees on your channels. However, the downer of this message is this would probably only work if the entire network does it, and if you only do it locally on your node, that probably doesn't change much. You could try to remove cycles from the topology and make more of a like hub and spoke topology. You can increase the space of feasible wealth distributions. How do you do that? Well, you advertise for protocol developers to use something like channel factories or multi-party channels, which is kind of like the ARC model. Quick note on this. I think connecting ARCs via two-party channels is kind of like inefficient from a capital perspective. We should much rather upgrade the Lightning protocol to support multi-party channels and tell ARC nodes to be multi-party channels advertised in the Lightning network, because this would be much nicer from a reliability perspective. And of course, as I just showed you can exploit the positive results. You can create collaborative rebalancing to mitigate the bimodal priors. Remember, off-chain rebalancing is not circular, but it's a circulation, right? So you don't need to find circles. You need to have like a whole network of everybody having net flow of zero to replenish liquidity. So what are the key takeaways? We should distinguish between infeasibility of payments and the uncertainty of liquidity. Off-chain rebalancing does not change the feasibility of payments. That's one of the reasons why a lot of people didn't want to do these like circular things. Payments on-chain and on-chain operations, however, do change the feasibility of payments, and thus payments feasibility limits the scaling of Bitcoin payments, currently to a factor of about 10. I mean, it depends on the assumptions that you plug in here. Payment infeasibility cannot be decided given the lack of information, right? We don't know the wealth distribution in the network, but we can use the framework. But payments generally change the wealth distribution. Improving reliability is actually really a good idea because it helps you more quickly to decide if a payment is infeasible. If you have an unreliable network and you make a payment attempt over a payment attempt over a payment attempt and they fail, you don't know if they fail because the network doesn't have liquidity or if they fail because you just you didn't make the right guesses for the routes. So it's really good if you focus on increasing the reliability. I think the most important takeaway is that two-party channels are too heavy constrained to the locked liquidity, and multi-party channels heavily increase the degrees of freedom of the liquidity. Selfish behavior and cycles lead to depletion of channels. Money cycles around the network in a preferred direction. Still, we get bimodal priors, which is a little bit surprising because you would assume it's always on one side of the channel, but the side can flip very quickly. The network becomes more expensive and less reliable over time, which is related to the price of anarchy. And yeah, collaborative protocols are possible to mitigate the bimodal priors, which would increase the reliability, which would help us to make better decisions with on-chain transactions. So thank you very much, and I'm open to questions.
Hi, thanks for the talk. What are the current limitations for channel factories and multi-party channels? What are they technical or what?
Yeah. So as far as I understand, it's difficult to create a multi-party channel with a penalty-based system. So we would have to do construct that goes in the direction of L2, but for that we may need Bitcoin opcodes. So yeah, there's that.
Hey, awesome talk.
Thank you.
Does that 10x scaling ceiling that you're talking about kind of assume that like payments are equally likely to any node on the network as opposed to like some destinations are more likely to get payments?
Yeah. So, I mean, I was doing a random walk on the feasibility region, and I mean, I have to do some prior in that random walk. So, more or less, yes.
Yeah. Because then that might be kind of a pessimistic take.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, if you have better data, you can plug in better stuff into the model.
Oh no, I'm not criticizing it. For
No. But I'm saying, right?
Yeah, hopefully, it's a little bit better than that. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's have the fingers crossed. But what you have to note is the main problem here is this region. The more users and the more channels you have, relative to the outer region, gets smaller. And it kind of drops exponentially when you have the two-party channel, right? So the idea that just make the network bigger and things will get better, that's not necessarily the case. Yeah, so.
Hey, Rene, thanks for the talk. It's really interesting. Question would be regarding the multi-party channels or the effect of the multi-party channels. Wouldn't the channels between or two custodial entities or any kind of service which allows many people share the activity on one channel come to the same effect as a multi-party channel?
No, so the difference is this. If you have a federation and another federation, you could have several people that are in both federations. And if those are considered as multi-party channels, they would already be connected by many peers. Whereas if you have those channels and you connect them by a two-party channel between some operator, you have additional liquidity locked in there, and from the perspective of the network, it's just another two-party channel. And as I just discussed, more two-party channels on the network do not necessarily make the network better. More degrees of freedom for your liquidity make the network better.
Okay, thanks.
So what's your call to action for us?
Who is us?
The builders. the builders of Lightning? Like, are we supposed to focus on, for example, building collaborative rebalancing protocols? Like, what do you think? The
Yeah.
focus
So
should be?
I mean, okay. So I mean, the idea of sharing information in some sense is can be discussed, right? Because I mean, in one sense, it makes it better for you, but it also increases the selfish behavior of people. However, increasing the overall reliability of feasible payments, I think that's a general good idea because you can make quicker decisions. So that would be to focus on the collaborative rebalancing. That requires sharing information because you need the wealth distribution in order to do that. But I would argue that service providers should together share that information in order to replenish channels instead of using on-chain transactions. I mean, you can make the case that the mempool is empty right now and it doesn't matter, but on the long term, that's a good idea. I think the even better idea is to focus on how do we arrive at multi-party channels, because I think that's really the way. If you go to this table to get this kind of like feasibility, and the feasibility of payments is directly connected to the bandwidth of payments. I mean, right? I mean, even if you take Tyler's remark of what kind of assumption did you make of who pays whom, right? Even if you make a different assumption, yes, maybe this number switches a little bit, but the direction from this column to this column, I mean, that's straight. Whenever a payment is infeasible, you need to hit the chain. And in order to really scale, yeah. And multi-party channels is currently the only way that I see that really gives us a lot of scale for mathematical, geometrical reasons.